Thank you for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Jeremy Garber, and I'm the events coordinator for Powell's Books. Before we begin, I wanted to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. As well, if you haven't already done so, please sign up for our weekly events email at powells.com. I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge civil rights icon and 17-term Congressman John Lewis, who passed away on Friday. Powell's was honored to host Congressman Lewis in support of his incomparable autobiographical graphic novel trilogy, March, in both 2014 and 2015, and I cannot think of a more commanding speaker that we've hosted at Powell's. We are a brighter, more courageous, and more just nation because of his leadership and tireless work over the decades, and he will be missed dearly. This evening, we're honored to welcome Congressman Eric Swalwell and Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici, and we're excited to have so many of you joining us tonight. Congressman Eric Swalwell grew up in California's East Bay. After earning undergraduate and law degrees at the University of Maryland, he served as a prosecutor in the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. Elected to Congress in 2012 to represent the East Bay, he is now in his fourth term and serves on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Judiciary Committee. In his new book, he asks, how do you stop a rogue president? How do you protect our country from a man who lies, who obstructs justice, and who seeks to cheat with foreign powers to get reelected? Our Constitution offers one remedy, impeachment. Thanks to the courageous actions of public servants who came forward to report his abuses of power, on December 18th, 2019, President Donald J. Trump became just the third president in US history to be impeached by the House of Representatives. In his book, Endgame, Inside the Impeachment of Donald J. Trump, Swalwell offers the personal account of his path to office and how he and his colleagues resisted, investigated, and impeached a corrupt president. After the shock of the 2016 election and Trump's inauguration, Representative Swalwell, as a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the Judiciary Committee, quickly became involved in pushing back against Trump's outrageous actions as he sought to get to the bottom of foreign interference in our elections. Congressman Swalwell is joined in conversation tonight by Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici. A longtime consumer rights advocate and education activist, Congresswoman Bonamici has dedicated her career to increasing opportunity for children, families, and people struggling to make ends meet. Bonamici was first elected to the US Congress in a special election in 2012, representing Oregon's 1st District, and currently serves on the Education and Labor Committee, where she is chair of the Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Human Services. She also serves on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee and is one of 9 Democrats serving on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. She is a member of the Progressive Caucus and co-chair of both the House Ocean Caucus and the STEAM Caucus, which aims to educate innovators by integrating art and design into science, technology, engineering, and math. In Congress, she has been a steadfast champion for Northwest Oregon, as well as a vocal critic of the Trump administration. This evening's event will also include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, please consider upvoting that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Most importantly, please consider supporting Congressman Swalwell and Powell's by purchasing a copy of the Congressman's new book, Endgame. A link to buy the book will be shared in the chat this evening. Congressman Swalwell, Congresswoman Bonamici, it's an honor to welcome you both tonight.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you so much. And it's great to be here with my friend and colleague, Eric Swalwell. And I want to get right into the conversation with Eric. Welcome. I'm so glad you're able to do this. Yeah. And thank you, Jeremy, for the words of remembrance about our friend and colleague, John Lewis. It's not just Congress who lost a champion and a hero and a legacy. It's the whole country. And we will always be grateful for his leadership. Eric,
Suzanne,
do you want to welcome everybody first?
Is, just how many people, if you watch social media, have shared their photograph or story with John Lewis. It just shows that he was so accessible, not just to his colleagues, but everyone across the country, including your community coming to Powell's.
Yeah, indeed he was. And he was always so gracious and kind. And you know, now that we're talking with people in Portland, Eric, I just want to acknowledge it. It's a challenging time for our city right now. And I think about Congressman Lewis and his peaceful protests and nonviolent demonstrations. And I just want to acknowledge that is all happening in the background of what we're talking about today. So.
Well, your constituents are fortunate to have you fighting for them, because I've been following, it's the tradition, and for good reason, in our Congress, when a local issue occurs, you want to watch and see what the local representative does. And I saw that, immediately, you're calling for the administration to provide answers, and even rightfully, said that this type of action by the president without local involvement is something that a dictator would do. And I think
Absolutely.
You do have to call out, these actions for what they are. And so it's encouraging to see that you and your colleague Earl Blumenauer are, working to protect your great city.
We're in the fight along with our senators. So I'm going to start with a kind of a two-part question to set the stage here. So firstly, you have congressional duties in Washington, D.C. You live in California, you have 2 kids. So how in the world did you have time to write this book? And as you're answering that, can you tell us, there's a tremendous amount of detail in here and incorporating history and how your experiences along the way shaped your perception of what was happening. Do you have a really good memory? Did you take copious notes? Did you write it along the way? So kind of set the stage about how this book came about.
Well, again, thank you, Suzanne, for doing this. I wrote it because I felt that the people who are seeing corruption right now on the inside needed to know the stories of the people who came forward, and the people I saw, behind the scenes when we were doing the, depositions behind closed door, and the efforts to intimidate them, but they still persisted and came forward. My dad was a police chief, and my earliest lesson was watching him stand up to a corrupt mayor and losing his job for doing it. And so I also wanted to kind of draw the parallel of learning that lesson at a very young age, that some things are more important than your job, and then projecting that on what it taught me, being on both committees. So a tribute to the heroes who came forward, condemning those who were complicit in their silence or enabling the president, and then a call to action for all of us that we did not remove the president, but we have an opportunity to do that this November. Now, how did I write it? You're right. We're back and forth a lot. You get a lot of time on airplanes, but the most productive part of the day I found was whenever I was able to put my 1-year-old daughter, Cricket, down to sleep, I would always tell her a story or sing her a song, tell her a story.
About impeachment?
Yeah, not about impeachment. Morphed into that. So
a lullaby.
So I took out my phone and downloaded a dictation app, and I would use the half hour or hour that it took to get her down, and I would recount for her what had happened during the day, and it would record, transcribe, and then I could move it into a Word file. But the only way that she would go along with it was if I did it in a sing-song voice. One of the chapters was about the skip storm, and so I'm telling her, Mr. Schiff says to Mr. Meadows, please sit down. You are not recognized. So I kind of had like a Dr. Seuss, cadence to it. So I guess it could be adapted, as a children's book if it ever needed to be.
It kind of puts a whole new perspective on it. So you do talk a lot about your family and how your experience kind of shaped you. How did that play into your actual strategy and your work on the committees that had the primary responsibility? You're on the 2 committees that were really front and center in the impeachment. So how did those life experiences come into your approach?
I was raised in a law and order family, and in our family, even with 2 Republican parents, law and order does not mean using chemical weapons to break up peaceful protesters. It doesn't mean using your position of power, to fire people or bring cases against people that you don't agree with. It means that we all have to follow the same rules. And so I tried to use that perspective, to appeal, as we talked publicly about what we were doing and what was at stake, to people who still did care about that sentiment that we all had to follow the same rules. And the president in his asking of the Ukrainian president to do us a favor, though, and invoked our taxpayer dollars to get the Ukrainian president to investigate his rival, was doing everything that we would not want from a small town mayor, a governor, or as high as the president of the United States. And so that was always the way I approached this was, what did my dad teach me? I have two brothers who are police officers in Oakland. What do they care about? And I think, most people just want to believe that there's one set of rules and we all have to follow it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I remember all the conversations from the time of the 2018 election, actually really starting before that, when the conversations were about, are we going to impeach? And there were, of course, comments made, colleagues calling for impeachment throughout from the time of the inauguration, really. Where did you see a turning point in realizing that this isn't talk anymore? We're going to actually do something.
And I had sensed, just like I think most of us, from the day the president was inaugurated, that we may have to impeach him, not because I think there was any, inclination to do that. It was just he had operated as a corrupt, businessman, someone who, would cheat people often out of the contracts, and a lot of people were left, penniless because he didn't own up to what he owed them. He's had, he came into office and immediately had a $25 million settlement with students who were defrauded, by Trump University. So to me,
outrageous.
Right. And so I guess it wasn't a surprise that he was going to eventually be impeached. And I wrote a chapter called Gradually Then Suddenly. And it comes from a Hemingway book where one character asks another, how did you go broke? And the character said, 2 ways, gradually and suddenly. And that's how I felt like impeachment happened, that there were different acts, from welcoming the Russians to the firing, of Comey, that, led us in that direction. But the sudden act was when we learned what had happened with President Zelensky. And so I would say the Mueller testimony, although Bob Mueller, I don't think met the, performative standards that people in the press were holding him to, a good amount of our colleagues who were not on board before impeachment had moved toward it after that report came out and the special counsel testified. And then, as you probably remember, it was our freshmen, we call them the national security Dems.
Exactly.
Who wrote an op-ed right after the Zelensky call was revealed. And I think that was probably, the most momentous time for it.
The turning point. So talk a little bit about John Bolton. So he now says the impeachment inquiry wasn't wide enough, but he wasn't like knocking on the door to cooperate, right? Tell me what you think about this. And now he has his book, and where was he during the impeachment?
And his book is called In the Room Where It Happened, which I think is an interesting title because the room where it happened was the Ways and Means Committee room,
right?
Where Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Masha Yovanovitch and Fiona Hill, they came forward, they raised their right hand, gave sworn testimony to speak truth to power. And Ambassador Yovanovitch had lost her job, for speaking up. We just saw Lieutenant Colonel Vindman had to retire because they were running op research against him to find a way to not give him his promotion. That's the room where it happened. And we had asked Bolton by subpoena, and then during the Senate trial, the impeachment team asked for an affidavit, and both times he wouldn't do it. So it feels a little bit like, a firefighter that shows up with his truck and his hose when the building's, in smoldering ashes and says, hey guys, I'm here to help. And it's great. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't look at, and we are looking at on the Intelligence Committee, what he has alleged as far as the president also wanting to work with China, or telling the Turkish government that he'll make cases go away once he gets his own team at the Southern District of New York. We'll look at that, but John Bolton does not deserve in history to be in the same pages as the people who worked for him, like Vindman and Fiona.
Indeed. It was also a song from Hamilton. I just have to add that. So you talk about in the book, you talk about how you wanted to create an independent commission to investigate Russian interference in the election. How do you think things would have been different had there been enough cooperation? I mean, those 2 years from the time of the inauguration till the 2018 election, it was really, we were like swimming upstream and playing defense the whole time. But if that effort had been successful, how do you think that would have changed things?
It didn't belong in Congress. I felt very strongly about that from the very beginning. And I kind of harkened back to being an intern on the Hill when September 11th happened, and seeing that the calls for a commission, an independent commission, ultimately brought the best reforms, because they took, what was becoming a polarizing issue. We united in Washington around, our country after September 11th, but in the months afterward, as questions started to be raised about what did the Intelligence Committee know, you started to see a fracture. And thankfully, there was an independent commission, and we're safer today from terrorism because they took it outside of Congress. And so I proposed, working with one of the vice chairs of the September 11th Commission, Lee Hamilton, to do the same thing here. I sense, as you did, that it was just too toxic for us to handle it, because if you said Russia, the Republicans believed that you were questioning the legitimacy of the president's election and that they didn't want to talk about it. And so the commission would have had a bipartisan panel of experts, statespersons, scholars tell us what we could do to make sure it never happened again. And you signed on to it. Every Democrat signed on to it. And Suzanne, that that's easier said than done. Getting every one of your colleagues to sign on to it, something like that is very hard. But I was fortunate that Speaker Pelosi supported me in that, and Elijah Cummings was the first co-sponsor of the bill and helped me get others to sign on. And I wanted it to be bipartisan. In fact, I held back on introducing it, trying to get Republicans, and I was only ultimately able to get 2. And one Republican on the Intelligence Committee, I'll never forget her telling me this. She said, "Eric, I agree with everything you're saying about Russia. I don't like what the president's doing to embrace them, but when he tweets, he wins." And what she was signaling was that, she was afraid that if she spoke up, just signing on to a commission, that he would go after her and it would hurt her in her own party. And you and I have seen so much of that, since 2016.
Indeed. What was the most surreal moment you witnessed during the impeachment investigation, and what was the most disturbing?
The most disturbing was when the Republicans stormed the SCIF. So the SCIF, what is that? It's the basement, 3 floors below the Capitol, post September 11, a secure compartmentalized information facility was built. So it's a large hearing room. And before you go into the hearing room, we've always kind of joked on the Intelligence Committee that you check your phone and your politics. So there's a cubby for your phone, and you just don't bring your politics into the hearing room, because there's no cameras, there's no transcript that will be immediately released. It won't be released for at least 25 years when it's declassified. And so you can really be independent and work with Republicans, where there's consensus. And that's always been the history of the committee. It's a secure place, both, physically and also just in the way that we are able to function. And the day after we had received testimony from Bill Taylor, where the president convened supporters at the White House and told them, fight harder. He literally said that, fight harder. The next morning, we're sitting at this long conference room table at the SCIF, which is just like a long wooden table. And the witness, Laura Cooper, who worked at the Pentagon, she's about to sit down. And then she just abruptly leaves. And the next thing I hear are the voices of men chanting, let us in, let us in. And all of a sudden, you just see this flood of Republican members come in, and they've got their phones in their hands. They're wearing their iPhone watches. And I just had this sinking feeling, because, I and everyone on the committee knows the national security risks of having a device in there and what it could do to compromise force protection and, our deepest secrets to protect the country. And there was little regard for that. Instead, they were getting up in Adam Schiff's face and accusing him of running a star chamber. And
just to clarify, the Republicans on the committee
were allowed in.
Were allowed in there, right?
But they most of them were allowed in. They brought in people who were not allowed in, again, but most offensively was just that they had brought their, devices in. And I'll never forget, Suzanne, our colleague Mike Quigley he always brings, for all the committee members, Republicans and Democrats, he passes around a bag of Snickers. I think he's got Mars, the candy company in his district.
In Illinois.
And as one of them is just shouting, and he's red in his face, and he's pointing at all of us, one of the Republican members, Mike pulls out his bag and says, "You want a Snickers?" You know, kind of like the "Are you hangry?" commercial.
Right,
that
right. Oh,
they do. But that was the most disturbing, was to see the lack of regard for the rules. The most inspiring was the day that Masha Yovanovitch testified. And if you remember, as she was testifying, the president was tweeting at her.
Right.
And
I was in the room where it happened when she testified, and I do remember.
And so the president's tweeting at her, and I saw it on Twitter and wrote a note to Schiff because he was about to begin his questioning of her. And so he checked the tweet and read it too. He was the first person who would read it to her. And to see the look on her face where it's just like, are you kidding me? I was fired for standing up to this guy, and now he's trying to publicly humiliate me. But the inspiring part was that she went on, was unshakable. And as she stood up, if you recall, the entire room erupted in applause, and she just walked off, you know, with her dignity intact. And I think it really set the table for what was at stake during those hearings.
Exactly the kind of person you want in the position she held. Exactly. So the book is called Endgame, and tell me what you think that is. What is the Endgame?
So it's a Taylor Swift song. It's also the name of an Avengers movie. But in chess, it's the final stage of a chess match right before a checkmate. And so the theory of the book is that from now until November, there's two possible end games. One would be the devolution of Trumpism into a full-out autocracy for our country, which I think you alluded to earlier this week when you were talking about what was going on in Portland, that the rule of law and the freedom of press would be completely thrown out, and there would be a set of rules that we have to follow, and then a set of rules that the president and his cronies could follow and benefit
without regard to constitutional protections.
Exactly. The other end game, which I believe is the result that we'll achieve, is a redemption and rebuilding of our country. That we come out of this and make the reforms that are needed to make sure no executive ever can abuse power in this way, and by people showing up at the polls, that's the civic redemption that John Lewis would have wanted all of us to engage in. Going from the town squares to the town halls, all the way to the ballot box on November 3.
And that's when the public realizes, wow, we didn't realize it could get this bad. We better make sure it doesn't happen again. Learn from history. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts, and you were a prosecutor, I know. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on what's happened recently with Roger Stone commutation, Manafort's not in prison anymore, Flynn case dismissed. How does that make you feel as someone who wants to see justice and wants to see people held accountable?
I feel like I dropped the curtain on the book probably a little too early because there's further acts that could have been documented, but that just fits the pattern of conduct the president's demonstrated, which is he protects his friends and punishes his enemies. And so we have Attorney General Barr coming to the Judiciary Committee next week, and there's going to be a lot of questions about what he sees his role as. Is it America's Attorney General, or is he acting as the president's fixer? And there's a lot of evidence, and we've had hearings leading up to this suggesting that he's working as the president's fixer. You look at the Roger Stone's sentence was commuted twice. It was first commuted by the Attorney General, who overruled his prosecution team and their sentencing recommendation for what Stone had done. And then, of course, by the president. There's the Flynn case that's now been dismissed and still being litigated in the circuit court. But the Attorney General seems to act for the president, not for us. And speaking of punishing enemies, the same day that the Supreme Court said that the Manhattan District Attorney's Office can cede the president's taxes, they just have to articulate exactly what they want to do. Michael Cohen, who was out because of COVID, was told he had to sign a waiver of his rights, that he could not write a book or appear publicly in an interview. And when he refused to do that, he was sent back to jail. Jeffrey Berman, the Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney, a couple weeks ago was told that if he left his post so the president could have one of his own persons, not a court-appointed Southern District prosecutor, that Berman would be given a no-show job. That's what the Attorney General said. You can spend the next 5 to 6 months not having to work. We'll give you a post. You can build a book of business, is what the Attorney General told him, but just get out of the president's way. And Berman refused to do so and was fired, and had the Attorney General smear him in his press release. So that's where we are right now. We're not helpless. We do have the power of oversight, but again, not to keep foreshadowing what we have to do. It is the ballot box. That's where the last change will come.
And I'm going to get to the Q&A here, but one more thing. Now we've had these recent revelations now that Russia's offering bounties for killing U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and either the president, it's a kind of a lose-lose. If he didn't know about it, that's a problem. If he knew about it, didn't do anything about it, that's a problem. How does this relate to the impeachment investigation?
Yeah. Well, it fits right squarely into the pattern of a person who puts his own interests, either financial, political, or personal, above the country's. And there's overwhelming evidence that the president, in the way that he has favored Putin, discredited his own intelligence committee, favored Putin. The argument that the president and his defenders in Congress made about the president working with Ukraine was exactly Putin's argument, which was that Ukraine was responsible for the 2016 interference, not Russia, and the president had a right to want to investigate that. So they truly are laundering, Russian misinformation. And so I've been briefed on the allegations around Russian bounties. The evidence is quite credible. It's not a hoax. It's not something that was written for the president on the back of a bar napkin. And Suzanne, if what is publicly reported in the press is true, that it was also in the president's daily brief, and that it was something that was shared with allies, and that our own force protection had changes made to it, meaning how we assemble the troops, then it's no longer immeasurable as to what the president's relationship with Putin costs us. There's actually, a real cost that we can associate with it, and it's the lives of American troops. And so I think, we have to continue to hold them accountable from now until November, but that type of person should not be the commander-in-chief of our forces.
No kidding. Here's an easy question for you. How did you end up at Campbell U?
So I played, I loved soccer growing up, and no one in my family had gone to college, and my parents wisely saw that soccer was a potential way to help us pay for it, because it was going to be a financial burden with 3 younger brothers. And so I would actually go to these college recruiting camps in Beaverton every year, and Campbell was one of the schools that scouted me. And I had 3 requirements as a naive 17-year-old. 1, I needed it to be paid for. 2, I wanted to play Division I. And 3, I was so impatient, I didn't want to sit on the bench and play, my junior, senior year. And so Campbell was the only school in the country that fit all 3. They pay for it. They're the smallest Division I school in the country, I think. And I was able to play as a freshman. So off I went to North Carolina, just outside Fayetteville, and played there for 2 years, and then got injured and transferred to Maryland.
Okay, so who's your favorite MLS team then?
Oh boy, well, San Jose, obviously our hometown team. DC United is fun to watch when I'm in Washington, and I'm glad it looks like, been able to safely try and make it work. It's hard to adapt during COVID. I think America does need sports if we can do it safely, but it shouldn't be done at the expense of testing for others. And I'll just, one brief COVID note, because our family's dealing with this right now. We have a family member who was exposed in the Midwest to a friend who had COVID, and their small business, just to give you a sense of what the delays in testing mean, they've had to shut down their small business with 12 employees and have put their customers on hold. And they've been told it could be up to 10 days to get a response. And so it's not just that, they're going to suffer. The economy around them and the people at their business are going to suffer because, we don't have the rapid testing responses that we need right now. And
we
so,
desperately need. I was hoping you'd get a shout out to the Timbers in there.
Casey Keller came from Oregon, though. Casey Keller came from Oregon. He was a player. He played at Portland, U of P, University of Portland, and he's a goalkeeper for the national team, and was kind of the person I had on the posters in my room growing up.
So I like this question. Somebody said, I read and enjoyed the book. One of the scariest stories was of your trip to Antarctica, which of course I was on.
There.
Showing how important it is that Democrats take the Senate as well as the presidency. Can you describe what was it about that trip that seemed scary, according to Kathy, who's asking this question? I know what the answer is. I want to hear your version.
So Suzanne, you and we were freshmen on the science committee. I don't know if you were also on the wait list, but it goes by seniority.
No, because I came in 2012. Yeah, so right.
Oh, that's right. You came in 2012, and so you were a couple more seats more senior than me. But I remember being put on the wait list to go on this trip, and then a bunch of others dropped out. And at the last minute, we're going to Antarctica for what we believed was going to be, a climate trip to study the effects.
Science committee, right?
Yeah, God forbid. And a couple of days into the trip, we start to realize that we're not being briefed at all on anything related, to climate chaos or what they do down there at McMurdo Station. Like their mission is almost entirely related to that. And right. One of us asked the National Science Foundation director, and I remember her telling us that she was instructed by the chairman, who was a Republican at the time, that was not to be a part, of our trip, which was just like we're going.
As we're watching the glaciers melt and talking to the scientists, right? We were there to learn about why is the National Science Foundation spending so much money on their station, and it was incredibly frustrating. And I might say that is key to why we have to address the climate crisis. We have to change the Senate and the presidency. So it was quite the trip. So there's a question here about how. Let's see, if Biden gets elected and Democrats take the Senate and keep the House, what do you think the priorities will be during the first 2 years that'll keep the country safe from despotism going forward?
I don't think the priorities are the same as they would have been stated 6 months ago. I do think that, we have not seen the Senate do enough, as it relates to, COVID relief and recovery. And so probably fulfilling what the shortfalls will be between the HEROES Act and what the Senate does, in the next a couple of weeks. I think, you tell me, Suzanne, I think that's going to be the priority. Unfortunately, the vice president has experience doing that,
right.
leading the effort out of the Great Recession.
Yeah, we have a lot of rebuilding to do, to be sure, but that could be an opportunity to rebuild in a sustainable way where we're opening up these opportunities to people who historically been left out. So Antonio wants to know, Vindman was hounded out of his job. McCabe's in the middle of a legal mess. Bolton got a big book deal. Why can't Congress protect whistleblowers or even bring their subpoenas to bear? And why are people doing their duty punished and those who don't get rewarded?
So I have legislation actually that we're pushing for right now on the Judiciary Committee, a Whistleblower Protection Act to further expand the protections that whistleblowers get and to make it a crime for anyone who would out a whistleblower. And we saw over and over during our investigation the attempted outing, of the whistleblower. If you remember, Rand Paul, even Louis Gohmert on the Judiciary Committee side, on the Republican side, read aloud a name that had been floated in conservative circles as the whistleblower. Rand Paul did the same thing during the Senate trial. It was just disgusting because, again, this used to be a bipartisan issue. It was never.
Right. I was going to say, wasn't the whistleblower statute a very bipartisan, maybe even led by Republicans to protect whistleblowers? That was astounding to me that they would just do that, knowing the risks and knowing the dangers.
Yeah,
unbelievable. There's a couple of questions about really good questions about concerns about election tampering with the upcoming election, and what is the DNC doing? What I would say, what are we doing? What is Congress doing? What is the public doing to avoid this or manage the concerns about election tampering?
Well, I would say that by most metrics, when a president has an economy as bad as we're in right now and has demonstrated such a failure of leadership, in a healthcare crisis, that he would be well on his way to being voted out of office. But I think candidate and Democrats have to go through this gauntlet of misinformation, welcoming foreign interference, and voter suppression. And so what we've tried to do, Suzanne, and you voted for this as well, is to extend, the election security fund that states can use to really harden their election systems. We've tried, and in our negotiations during COVID relief packages, we've tried to include vote from home provisions, just as Oregon does, to make that.
We call it vote by mail. We've had it for close to 20 years. It works. It's secure, had bipartisan support, and all of a sudden it turns into this, the president's trying to say it's dangerous, it's a fraud, it's fraught with fraud. It isn't. We know how to do it. We have a paper trail.
I saw the study in Oregon. It was, I think it's like 0.0000 something % of like instances of fraud. I mean, it's almost nearly perfect.
I had a conversation with our former Secretary of State, who was a Republican. He passed away, and now because of our Oregon law, he's replaced with a Republican Secretary of State, both of whom support vote by mail. And the late Secretary of State came to DC for these election security things, and he told me, because I asked him about it. I said, people are alleging that there's fraud in the system. He said, you could count on practically on one hand the number of cases. And they were typically parents who tried to sign their kids' ballots when their kids went off to college and didn't change their address. This is not the sort of blatant election manipulating fraud that I know Trump is suggesting. So,
it also doesn't benefit. There's been no evidence that one party benefits over it
exactly
than another.
Not at all.
We had a special election in Southern California a couple months ago.
I saw that.
The Republican won, and that was it from the president, right? He was saying up until that election that it was fraudulent in that special election, and the Republican won, and now he hasn't said a word about it.
Yeah. Well, especially during a pandemic. So there's that kind of concern about the actual, getting ballots to people and voter suppression issues. Talk a little bit about the disinformation. You probably learned a lot about that in your work on judiciary and intelligence, because when you I don't know if you saw the documentary about what happened with the hack in 2016 and all the disinformation, and tell me a little bit about what we can do about that, because in the long term, that we need education and media literacy and tech literacy and but civic, in the short term, civic education.
So ideally, the person behind the steering wheel, leading our country, would lead the country and take us in a direction that confronts this head on, calls out adversaries that engage in this. But you could have the best FBI agents, CIA agents, Homeland Security agents in the car with him, telling him which direction to go. But if the person behind the wheel, takes us off the cliff or goes in the wrong direction, like we can't do much. But we can in Congress, I think, conduct oversight and expect more from social media companies, for example. And there's a lot more that they're going to have to do to identify it on their platform, make their users aware of it, and not let especially foreign actors use their platforms. Now, one scenario that I am increasingly worried about, and I'm worried about it because it was presented to me by a former chief security officer at a social media company, is the days between the election and inauguration day. And as he described it to me, if he were Russia, he would use that opportunity with a president who's not willing to concede the election and claiming that there's voter fraud. He would use that as an opportunity to really amplify, stories of not having your vote counted or excess ballots showing up at a polling station, and just creating a bunch of fake news stories so that we tear ourselves apart. And so I asked Facebook about this scenario in a public hearing that we had on the Intelligence Committee a couple of weeks ago. And I was heartened to hear that they and Twitter and Google are doing what they call red teams. They're running these types of scenarios to see what they could do to respond, because if the president's not going to be up for it, they really have to be on the beat. Yeah,
and there's some more questions here, kind of along the same theme of this is a pretty corrupt administration, concerned that they will escape justice, certainly try to escape justice. if Biden is elected and we have the ability to dig into the criminal acts of the Trump administration, will you commit to pushing for a full and comprehensive investigation into the administration and their political appointees and work to ensure that they do face justice, even if that requires pushing back against Democratic leadership?
Yes, I will. And I think it's important that we come to terms and we're honest about what the president and his team did. But, Suzanne, just as I called for an independent commission, after the Russia interference campaign, not just for the president's sake and, everyone who was concerned about it, our sake and the public's sake, I think the same here is that there should be a, presidential crimes commission, but it should be independent and it should have no regard for politics. It should just follow the evidence and the law and make recommendations. I think that's the only way it'll be accepted by the public. And I don't think any of us want to punish someone because of their political beliefs, but I also believe that if we don't enforce the law, we could see this happen again in our country.
Right, which is why we absolutely had to go forward with the impeachment, because we couldn't send a message that what the president did was acceptable and could go unchecked, to be sure. So someone's concerned that the post office may be crippled before the election. And so with more people voting by mail, what happens if the ballots don't get to the right place on time? What if a state doesn't certify the election? And under what circumstances might the election be thrown to the House?
Only in a tie would it go to the House. And in that case, it's not who's in the majority. Each state gets one vote. And so if you're Alaska and you have one member of Congress, you're as equal as California, with over 50 members of Congress. Now we're right now, if that scenario were to prevail, I think the Republicans have a 5 or 6 state advantage, but there are a number of states where the congressional balance is in play, like in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Florida, where we could flip that advantage. Let's not let it come to that. We don't see that play out. So all of that being said, I really believe the best tact for us has to be to just inspire people to overwhelm the ballot box so the result cannot be denied. And I wrote this in the book. I think ultimately Donald Trump is a coward, and that when public pressure is put on him, he backs down. He never really has principally stuck to his corruption. When his corruption is exposed, he usually reverses his position because he's been caught. And the example I think that is best is, even though we didn't remove him with impeachment, only once we launched the investigation did Ukraine get the aid. If this was such a principled view on his part, he would have given Ukraine the aid. And I remember throughout the investigation, one of our biggest points was that from the time we launched the investigation until the time they got the aid, nothing changed. For all the fake concerns the president had put out there, none of those concerns were met. The only thing that changed was that an investigation was launched. And so I think if we really blow out this election, he's going to recognize that, there's no way out. My fear is that if it's close, in that he would find the chaos and he would be able to, really divide us.
Indeed, because he definitely is a master of chaos. Yeah. So I want to talk about the part of the book that I was just listening to, where you're talking about Mitt Romney. Because, you're talking about how, well, there may be more states with Republicans. At some point, will there be more Mitt Romneys? Will there be people who just realize this doesn't help our country? Are there more people who will put country before party when looking at the possibility, which we hope would never happen, of a second Trump administration? Will there be more Mitt Romneys and people who aren't afraid to speak up? Justin Amash.
I hope so. And I think we have to not be self-righteous, when they do speak up. We should, thank people like Mitt Romney. And I think a lot of the, never Trumpers. I heard that John Kasich may address the Democratic convention. That'd be great. We should welcome him. And people are saying, some of my friends today were texting me about the Lincoln Project and saying, I don't want you retweeting them because they are going to turn all their information against us in 2022. And I said back to him, I said, if we beat Donald Trump, win the Senate and win the House, give me the problem that the Lincoln Project is not with us in 2022. Like right now, like we have a corrupt president And so let's welcome people who want to work with us, regardless of what their political affiliation was. I'm afraid, though, that for most of our colleagues, there's been so many off-ramps that they did not take where they could have shown courage. And if we can't change their minds, we're now in a position where we just have to, work hard to change their seats.
And from your experience and, sitting in these committees and being on the impeachment team and serving on intelligence, people ask me this question quite frequently. They say, do you think that Republicans really believe in Donald Trump and really agree with him? Or are they afraid that if they criticize him, that will be the end of their political career? What's your sense of that? Or does it depend on?
Yeah, you and I both have friends on the other side. We both have legislation that Republicans are signed on to. And, I wrote this in the book that the hardest part about all of this are the friendships that I've lost or the relationships that have cooled, because what I first saw in the days after Donald Trump was elected was that fear, recognizing that what he had done was wrong or what he was saying was wrong, but a fear of speaking out because they would be primaried. And then this just transition to out and out enabling him. And people ask me a lot about the Intelligence Committee. Please tell me when you're below ground, no cameras, that you guys are hearing from them that they don't like what the president's doing. I told him, I'm afraid it looks exactly like it does above ground right now. And so, again, I think it's just going to have to be the hard lesson of their constituents having the final word. But also for us, if there is a day after Trump, being open-minded enough, if there are never Trumper Republicans who want to work with us, not to just write them all off, but to give them that on-ramp, to uniting and fixing the country. I think that's going to be hard for us, but we have to do it.
Right. No, absolutely. And I remember during the time of the Mueller report, when all that came out, it seemed like there was a lot sort of hinging on this I believe it's a Justice Department policy that we don't indict a sitting president. So once the president is no longer a sitting president, it goes back to that question of what's going to be done to hold him accountable. And is it your sense that he knows that because of he's been protected, that is when he's not a sitting president anymore, he will be targeted, rightly so, for his wrongdoing?
So, what's funny, Suzanne, is that he is the Justice Department, right? He goes out of his way to remind us that he is the top law enforcement official in the country. So it's his policy. Like he owns it. The Justice Department wrote an opinion that said the president can't be indicted, but he could say that I'm throwing this opinion out. I hope the next president, Republican or Democratic, throws that opinion out, because I don't think any president should have that type of immunity. But as far as criminal violations, right, exactly. And so as far as criminal violations go, he's still individual one, right? I mean, that's not going away. That has a 5-year, up to 7 years if it's a conspiracy, statute of limitations. There's still the 10 obstructive acts that Mueller laid out that said he couldn't prosecute him because he is the president. It looks like, there's an investigation into Rudy Giuliani that is ongoing, that's been publicly reported. And of course, if what John Bolton said is true about China and Turkey, there may also be, criminal liability there. Again, I just hope it's looked at by prosecutors who just want to follow the evidence of the law, not seem political at all.
This is a good question. Oh, I lost it. It's about how can we, I'm going to find it here. Richard wants to know, how do you think we might be able to leverage energy of the civil rights protests to help unseat Trump? It seems that our most important goal at this point is to remove him before we can begin to gain any momentum toward the many reforms that are needed.
I think we have to recognize how much we've already accomplished. And, when you're in the moment, it feels like nothing is moving as fast as you'd like. But if you go to the day after Donald Trump was, inaugurated, millions of women led us in marches across the country. And there were marches for science and marches for climate. And at the end of 2017, that dark year, we won a Senate seat in Alabama, of all places. And it was Black women who showed up at the polls and registered others. And they were the force for Doug Jones to win. In 2018, of course, we swept the midterms. And then 2019 in Virginia, we flipped the legislature there. They passed background checks in a state where the NRA is headquartered. And in Kentucky, we won the governor's office. And so people kept marching and saw change happen. And now today in 2020, not only have we passed racial justice reform in the House, but I would say the cultural and corporate reforms that are happening are just as important. And by the way, 2 weeks ago in Oklahoma, Oklahomans voted to join Obamacare. And so change is happening, and we just can't relent and just have to keep moving our feet.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about your work with like Future Forum. When you talk about change and change is coming, sometimes people say that young people are apathetic. And I really have seen from the climate March for Our Lives against gun violence, that young people are very active and very concerned about shaping their future. So how do you see the new generation of citizen voters, participants in our community, and your work on the Future Forum?
When I started Future Forum, it was Speaker Pelosi who came to me and said, we're electing younger and younger members, and I hope you'll go learn what young people care about, report back to your colleagues, and do something about it. And there were about a dozen of us at the time in the group. Today, we have over 50 members in our 40s and under who are diverse in every way, by gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, background, geography. And many of us have also, young kids. And so on the issue of gun violence, we have that fear that we would send our child to school, and we remember what we dress them in case we ever have to think about that later on in the day. That is just something that young parents think about. You dread the call from the school. It's not, did little Johnny get in trouble? You fear the worst now. And because that is something that is among us as a group, I think we have a chance to be a force in Congress. And what we've heard from young people, there's 5 issues that pop all over the country, no matter where we are. It's racial justice, it's addressing climate, it's student loan debt, it's gun violence, and it's healthcare. And if you're authentic in the way that you listen to and speak to, I think our peers in that generation, and then are willing to be held accountable, I think they'll show up. And I'm inspired that in the midterms, there was we doubled the voter turnout for young people from how they showed up in 2014.
That's amazing. And I wanted to mention too, with a progress in 2018. So I grew up in Michigan, so I always watch what's happening there. They elected a woman governor, Governor Whitmer, a woman Secretary of State, and a woman Attorney General, and they're all Democrats. It's all flipped from Republicans.
They call themselves the other women, right?
Yeah,
that's what the president calls them.
And they would send a lot more women to Congress, although we still have a lot of work to do.
Haley Stevens and Alyssa Slotkin. Yeah.
Exactly. So this. I'm going to combine these 2 questions. One of them, because they're related. Vicki wants to know, what are the deficiencies in our American system of government or in our laws that allowed the current slide toward autocracy, and how can those be remedied? And this one says Rep. Bonamici, but to both of us, what can we as your constituents do to help get the federal law renegades from disrupting our city?
Well, I would say one of the deficiencies is how slow our courts move in a constitutional crisis. And the question you asked earlier about Bolton, we did not want to chase him in the courts, and right now, we're chasing Don McGahn, the president's former counsel, in the courts, and we started that litigation before Bolton, and we still have not had a hearing in the Supreme Court for that. So we know how long it would take, and I do think that we're going to have to look at fast-tracking constitutional questions in the courts, so that you're not allowed to essentially just run out the clock or take a knee on the ball and not see any action, as the president has been doing. Also, I think we have to update, how we hold people in contempt. And I don't think we need to, prior Congresses over 100 years ago, people, would go to jail and they'd sit in the congressional jail. I think if we just fined people, if it was a $10,000 a day fine for not showing up to a congressional subpoena, like that would be a powerful motivator. So there's a lot of deficiencies, and those are 2 reforms. But I'll defer to you on what's going on in your great city.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Farah, for asking about what you can do to help get the federal law renegades from disrupting our city. You know that Trump said he sent them to help. They're not helping. We know they're not helping. People are rightly protesting police brutality. And if there's one thing that's perfectly clear, to address the concerns of people who are seeking fairness in our system and wanting us to address the systemic racism we've had, but protesting police brutality, you don't address those concerns by more police brutality. And what's happening is because these federal officers who are wearing camo gear and at one point grabbed a man on the street, put him in an unmarked car, pulled his hat over his face, took him to question him, only let him go after he asked for a lawyer. That should not be happening in the United States of America. It's absolutely outrageous. And just over this past weekend, Commissioner Myron, Multnomah County Commissioner, who happens to be an emergency room doctor, she was gassed with no warning in a group that included healthcare professionals and elderly people. And then, of course, Donovan, who was shot. They call this a less lethal munition. Donovan's still in the hospital. He was seriously injured, and his skull was cracked. And so I mention that because I think about John Lewis, and when John Lewis walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and was beat, and his skull was cracked. They were both in their, Donovan's in his 20s and John Lewis was in his 20s. John Lewis believed in peaceful protesting. We believe in peaceful protesting, and we have so many people showing up, exercising their First Amendment rights. So we are calling out this administration. It is completely unacceptable that they are not identifying themselves. We don't know who they are. We think they're with this team from Customs and Border Patrol, like a SWAT team, Customs and Border Patrol. And we don't know whose orders they're following. We know that the Department of Homeland Security's acting secretary was in town and not listening to the concerns of our governor and the mayor, saying, we don't want you here. So we are calling on the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security. We're demanding answers. We're working on legislation, the whole range of giving us the answers, but also, for example, requiring them to identify themselves, not going off of their federal property. But we don't want them there. They're not helping. What we need to do is come together as a community and work together to address that racism and police brutality. Find a completely different way to provide public safety so that everyone in our community is safe. They're not making it safe. So we keep calling them out and doing everything we can. It is just a real challenge when they are being so defiant. But, you know, in Portland, we have the wall of moms. That to me symbolizes what Portland is. You have the wall of moms linking arms, holding flowers, and exercising their constitutional rights. So please speak up, speak out. If you go downtown at night, please be careful and don't hesitate to let us know. If you're in my district, Earl's, let us and the senators know. We want to hear from you. We are your voice. So Eric, do you want to add anything to that?
I could not have said it better than you, Suzanne. Your community is so fortunate to have you fighting for them and recognizing why they're marching and what they're not marching for, as well as they're characterized by the president.
Right.
I'm inspired by, as you said, John Lewis. During the toughest times that we've gone through since you and I have been in Congress, I often think about how tough John Lewis had it. And, you know, as often as I would really lose my cool or get frustrated, you just hear John's voice of, you know, causing, you know, good trouble and necessary trouble, and his optimism, his sunny optimism that, you know, we would, you know, come out of this and we'd be better because of it. And so
never give up, never give in, and always keep the faith, is what John Lewis said. And that's what we have to keep in mind as well. Richard wants to know how we can motivate people to vote when Biden, a lackluster centrist, is a Democratic presidential candidate. My 30-second pitch is, it's not just about the presidency. Who do we want to be on the court? Who do we want to be leading the Department of Education? Who do we want to be the Secretary of State to rebuild our standing in the world? Who do we want to lead the EPA? It is about so much more. It is about our future.
Agreed.
You want a 30-second response? And then
we'll I agree with you. And we can't have four more years of this president. You know, the vice president called me when I stopped running for president. And he said to me on that call, he was the first person to call me. And he said, Eric, you know, during the debate, you said to pass the torch and we need to do that. And he said, I want you to know, I hear you. And I don't know if I'm going to be the nominee or the president, but if I am both, I promise that I will work to enable the next generation. And Suzanne, you and I have both worked with him.
I believe he will, absolutely.
He is a person of his word, and I really believe that.
Yeah, and I don't know who it's going to be, but I know he's going to have an awesome vice president as well.
Yeah.
And it looks like our time is up. I just want to thank you
for doing this.
Of course, for the discussion. Thank you, Powell's, for making this available. For
Congresswoman, it was an honor to host you. Thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. If you'd like to purchase a copy of the Congressman's book, the link is in the chat. Also, if you just go to powells.com, search for events, you'll see his book and all the upcoming events as well. Thank you both. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Powell's. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Powell's.
Stay safe, everybody.
Bye-bye.